The faint light from the kitchen window cast a glow into the cramped living room, where Ethan was curled up on the old, worn-out sofa. He turned over his heavy eyelids, squeezing shut against the early morning sunbeams, piercing through the gap in the curtains. The familiar ache in his back was a reminder of the long night shift at the factory, but it was a strange sound that fully woke him. It wasn't the roar of traffic from the highway, nor was it the groaning of the old heater. It was the soft clink of a metal spoon against a porcelain cup. Ethan shot up, sleep instantly vanishing. The rich aroma of coffee filled the air, the good stuff, the whole bean coffee he only allowed himself on holidays, not the cheap instant powder he usually choked down in a hurry each morning. He walked towards the kitchen, then froze in the doorway, his hand unconsciously tightening on the edge of the wooden table. A woman was standing there. Her back was to him, her chestnut brown hair still slightly damp as it fell over her shoulders. But what made Ethan freeze in place was the shirt she was wearing. It was just a plain, simple white work shirt, the cleanest and most intact one he owned, saved for Mia's parent-teacher conferences. Now it hung loosely on her oversized. On the floor by the door, a pair of mud-caked high heels lay haphazardly next to a dark leather handbag. They looked utterly out of place on the peeling vinyl floor of his apartment. As if sensing his presence, the woman stopped stirring. She didn't turn around immediately, merely tugging gently at the wide collar of the shirt. Her voice, calm and slightly hoarse, broke the silence. "My clothes were soaked. I borrowed this. I hope you don't mind." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He was at a loss for how to react to her strange, casual demeanor. "Who are you?" Only then did she slowly turn. A steaming mug of coffee was in her hand. Her face was pale, devoid of color, but her eyes were unnervingly calm. She looked directly at him, without a trace of fear. "You don't remember anything from last night?" Ethan remained silent. Memories began to flood back in slow motion. The storm, the headlights glaring through the rain, the screech of metal, and the biting cold as he pulled someone from a submerged car. He looked at the familiar shirt on her, then down at his own hands where grease stains still clung to the crevices of his unwashed fingernails. Claire poured another cup of coffee from the old pot and pushed it gently towards the empty chair across from her. Ethan didn't drink, nor did he sit. He kept a safe distance, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes filled with suspicion. "How long have you been here?" Claire shrugged, a natural gesture that nonetheless radiated exhaustion. "Since you pulled me out of the car." He slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. The air between them grew thick, the only sound the slow drip of the coffee maker. Claire tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear, revealing a slender wrist with a raw red scratch. Ethan wanted to ask if it hurt, but he stopped himself. Her calm, self-possessed manner created an invisible wall that made him hesitate. The two of them sat there in the tiny kitchen, each seemingly hiding their own thoughts. Suddenly, the creak of a bedroom door hinge shattered the silence. Mia emerged clutching a worn-out teddy bear, her messy hair covering half her face. She rubbed her eyes, looking bewildered at the strange woman before turning to her father. "Daddy, who is she?" Ethan quickly stood up, flustered, unable to find a suitable answer for his daughter. But Claire was faster. She set her mug down, bent down low, and smiled a gentle, warm smile that was a stark contrast to her earlier cold, distant expression. "Hi, sweetie. I'm just someone your daddy helped." Mia nodded, walking closer to the table. She sniffed the aroma from Claire's cup, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Your coffee smells better than Daddy's." Claire let out a short, genuine laugh. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate slightly. Ethan looked at his daughter, then at the strange woman in his old shirt, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze still wary. The small kitchen suddenly felt different, the smell of damp wood after the rain mingling with the rich aroma of coffee. But the peace didn't last long. Claire straightened up, placed her mug on the table, her voice returning to a serious yet gentle tone. "I think we need to talk." The wind howled through the corrugated iron sheets of the factory complex, the rain pounding on the asphalt like a frantic drumbeat. Ethan's old Ford pickup truck shuddered with each gust of wind. He had just finished his night shift. His shoulders ached, and his hands were still black with grease he hadn't had a chance to wash off. The voice of the radio announcer crackled intermittent. "Category 1 hurricane. All central routes are closed. Residents are advised to stay indoors." Ethan reached out and turned off the radio, muttering, "Good, no more calls tonight." He loosened his collar and glanced at the phone mounted on the dashboard. The signal bars were weakening due to the heavy rain. He immediately made a video call to Mia. His daughter's sleepy face appeared on the screen, flickering in the dim light of her night lamp. "Did you lock the door?" he asked urgently. "Yes. Did you buy milk? If the store hasn't been blown away, I promise we'll have it." They shared a brief laugh. The roaring wind outside drowned out their laughter. "Go to sleep, kiddo. I'll be home soon." "Okay. Drive safe, Daddy." The screen went black. All that remained was the sound of rain relentlessly beating against the windshield, isolating him in the cramped cabin of the truck. Ethan pressed the accelerator, and the truck slowly moved forward into the drenched night. His headlights swept across a flooded dark area ahead, suddenly reflecting something silver. Ethan instinctively slowed down. A sedan was lying on its side, half stuck in a deep ditch by the side of the road. The airbags had deployed a sea of white, and the interior dome light flickered on and off like a dying heartbeat. "Probably no one's in there," he reassured himself, his hand ready to steer away to avoid getting stuck. But then, a hand weakly slapped against the passenger side window, feeble, desperate. Ethan's heart clenched. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the slippery road before coming to a complete stop. He sat in the truck for a few seconds, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. If he got out there, he might get stuck in this storm too. But the faint sound of the hand slapping the window came again, haunting him. Ethan shifted into park, threw open the door, and rushed out. The wind whipped his jacket open, and the cold rain lashed his face, forcing him to squint. He shouted over the wind, "Can you hear me?" A hoarse, strained voice came from the cracked window. "Help! Me!" Without another thought, Ethan went back to his truck bed and pulled out a tire iron. He struck the edge of the glass hard. "Cover your face!" The glass shattered and rain poured into the last remaining dry space in the car. He reached in, cutting the seatbelt that was tightly cinched around the woman. She coughed, her body limp. "Grab onto me!" he yelled. "I can't breathe!" Ethan gritted his teeth and with all his might pulled her from the driver's seat. Just as her feet touched the muddy ground, a crackling sound came from the engine compartment behind them. Flames shot up for a second before being extinguished by the rain. Ethan lifted her into his arms and ran through the swirling puddles back to his truck. He laid her down on the back seat, grabbing an old blanket from his toolbox to cover her. The woman was unconscious, her lips purple, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He turned on his phone's flashlight and checked her pulse. It was weak, but it was there. "Hang on," he whispered, his hands trembling from the cold and adrenaline. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed 911. No signal. He tried calling his elderly neighbor. Still just a long, hopeless dial tone. Looking out, the electronic sign in the distance flashed a stark red message, "Road closed." The water on the main road was already over the tires. He looked at the soaking wet woman in the back seat. If he tried to get to the hospital, they'd both be swept away. He gripped the steering wheel and decisively turned the truck around, heading towards his shabby apartment complex. "My place is nearby," he said to the empty air as if making a promise. The apartment door swung open, and the familiar warmth and smell of damp wood greeted the two soaked figures. Ethan laid her on the sofa, then ran to get dry towels and warm water. Her brown hair was matted with water. Her face deathly pale, but her features still held an elegance that was foreign to this place. He opened his closet and took out the plain white work shirt, the cleanest and most intact shirt he owned. He carefully draped it over her, buttoning it up to her neck, and placed a glass of warm water on the table beside her. Looking down at the leather wallet that had fallen out of her handbag, he saw the embossed logo, Bennett Motors, and several large soaked bills. Bennett Motors. He let out a soft sigh, looking around his rundown apartment before muttering, "You've really strayed into a different world." The bedroom door creaked open. Mia's sleepy voice called out, "Daddy, who is that?" Ethan turned, blocking his daughter's view. "She was in an accident. Go back to sleep." "Is she going to be okay?" He looked at the woman sleeping soundly on the couch and smiled wearily. "I think she'll be fine." Mia didn't go back to her room. She quietly grabbed her blanket and came to sit on the floor next to her father. The two of them sat there under the soft yellow light, watching over the stranger's sleep. The rain outside gradually subsided. Ethan rested his head against the wall, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. On the sofa, the woman lay still, his white shirt draped over her shoulders like a fragile shield. A single lingering raindrop fell from the ceiling onto the hem of the white shirt, glittering in the yellow light, marking a rare moment of peace before the next day arrived. The coffee maker had stopped dripping, but the faint bitter aroma still lingered in the cramped kitchen. Ethan sat across from the strange woman, his hands clasped on the rough wooden tabletop. Claire gently swirled the coffee in her mug. The steam rose, obscuring parts of her face, but it couldn't hide the sharp, observant gaze fixed on him. "Last night, was that you?" Ethan asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. She nodded slightly, placing the mug down precisely on an old water stain on the table. "Yes. I thought you didn't remember. Doctors often say traumatic shock can cause temporary memory loss, but you seem to be lucid. Your car hit the old oak tree at the bend," Ethan said slowly, the images from last night replaying in his mind. "You passed out before I could get the door open. I had no choice but to bring you here." Claire glanced around the apartment again. Her eyes lingered on the cracks in the drywall, the old humming refrigerator in the corner, then returned to him. "And now I'm drinking coffee in your house. Life really does have some unexpected plot twists." The atmosphere between them was strange. It held the warmth of salvation, but lacked any sense of familiarity. Ethan felt her presence here in his oversized white shirt was both natural and profoundly wrong. He stood up, pushing his chair back. "If you're feeling better, I can call a cab for you. The roads should be clear by now." Claire didn't answer right away. She leaned slightly to look through the dusty window. Outside, the wet pavement reflected the sunlight. A sleek black sedan was parked there, having been there since who knows when. A chauffeur in a black suit stood with his arms crossed, occasionally glancing at his watch, his posture patient yet exuding pressure. "No need," Claire replied, her tone as casual as if having a luxury car waiting in this run-down neighborhood was the most natural thing in the world. "My driver has been waiting since this morning." Ethan frowned, surprised. "And you're still sitting here?" Why, Claire turned back, looking directly into his eyes. "Because I thought I should thank you properly before I leave." She paused for a beat, setting her coffee mug down. Claire gently touched the collar of the white shirt she was wearing, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "And return this." Ethan flushed, slightly caught off guard by her sudden playful tone. Just then, a high-pitched voice came from the bedroom door. Mia peeked out, still clutching her teddy bear, her big round eyes staring at Claire. "Daddy, she's wearing your shirt." Ethan turned to his daughter, his voice firm yet gentle. "Mia, go get ready for breakfast. It's not polite to stare." Claire laughed. This time the smile reached her eyes, melting away her earlier coldness. She winked at the little girl. "Don't worry, I'm just borrowing it. I promise I won't spill any coffee on it." Mia giggled and ran off to the bathroom. The atmosphere in the kitchen softened a bit, as if the child's innocence had smoothed over the sharp edges between the two adults. But as soon as the sound of running water came from the bathroom, Claire's smile faded. She bent down and placed her dark leather handbag on the table. The metallic sound of the zipper was sharp and dry. "Last night you saved my life," Claire said, her voice returning to its usual professional tone. "I'm not used to being indebted to anyone, especially for my life." She pulled out a thick stack of cash neatly clipped together and slid it across the table towards Ethan. The crisp, large bills sat starkly against the scratches of the cheap wooden table. Ethan looked at the money, then up at her. His jaw tightened, his eyes growing colder. "What are you doing?" "I want to thank you," Claire replied, unfazed. "This is enough to fix your roof, or buy that little girl some better things." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising tide of pride in his chest. He used 2 fingers to slowly push the stack of money back towards her. "I didn't save you for money, and I don't need your money." Claire held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I know you didn't do it for money, but I don't like the feeling of being indebted. Consider this a fair exchange. In my world, everything has a price." Ethan stood up, his shadow falling across the table, obscuring the stack of cash. His voice dropped firm and resolute. "Then you should know that in this kitchen some things can't be bought or sold. Keep your money. You don't owe me anything?" Claire stared at him for a long moment. She gripped the strap of her bag, her gaze wavering for a fraction of a second. a flicker of surprise mixed with reluctant respect. "I'm not used to being turned down," she said softly. "Then I guess you learned something new today," Ethan replied curtly. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Claire took the money back and put it in her bag. She stood up, adjusting the hem of the shirt she was wearing. "I should go." She walked to the door and slipped on her high heels, still caked with a bit of dried mud. Before opening the door, she paused and turned back to him, her hand gently stroking the cuff of the white shirt. She tilted her head slightly, a half smile playing on her lips. "To be honest, this shirt looks better on me than it does on you." Ethan just gave a faint, humorless smile, not responding. The wooden door closed behind her. The aroma of coffee in the room seemed to fade with the sound of her retreating footsteps. Ethan stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of the car engine starting and then smoothly driving away. Mia came out of the bathroom, her mouth still smeared with toothpaste, and climbed onto a chair. "Is she gone, Daddy?" "Yeah." "She went home." "Will she come back?" Ethan ruffled his daughter's hair, sighing. "If she does, it'll probably just be to return the shirt. People like her belong in tall glass buildings, not here." He started clearing the table. As he lifted the chair Claire had been sitting in, he noticed something small and white on the floor. Ethan bent down to pick it up. It was a business card. The cardstock was thick, high quality, cool to the touch. The embossed silver lettering glittered in the morning light. Ethan stood frozen, his thumb gently rubbing the words. Bennett Motors, the largest automobile manufacturer in the state. A place where mechanics like him could only dream of touching their engines. A strong gust of wind blew through the slightly ajar window, making the business card in his hand tremble. Ethan looked out at the sky, where the dark clouds had all dispersed, revealing a sky that was a piercing, unfamiliar blue. He understood that while last night's storm may have passed, another more complex and unpredictable storm had just begun to creep into his and his daughter's life. What did the mysterious woman wearing his only good shirt really want from him? And what she was about to say, would it change the entire course of their struggling lives? Remember to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. The sky after the storm was unusually clear. Puddles on the sidewalk reflected the harsh morning sun, but the air still held a damp chill. Ethan knelt on one knee on the wooden floor, carefully tying Mia's shoelaces. The toes of her sneakers were worn, but they were scrubbed clean. "Remember to take your umbrella, kiddo," Ethan reminded her, adjusting the collar of her jacket. Mia nodded, but her eyes were still fixed on the empty sofa where the strange woman had lain the night before. "Daddy is... she coming back?" Ethan paused for a beat. He stood up, handing her backpack to her, his voice low. "She's not like us, sweetie. She belongs to a different place, a place where storms are just evening news reports, not something that rips the roof off your house." "But she got wet in the rain too." Mia argued, her voice innocent but firm. "Everyone gets cold when they're wet." Ethan let out a small, half-bitter, half-loving smile. He ruffled her hair. "Yeah, but people like her don't usually stick around. Let's go. The bus is coming." After putting Mia on the school bus, Ethan returned to the apartment. The silence that enveloped the small space felt different, heavier than usual. He hung his jacket on the hook, his eyes unconsciously scanning the small kitchen. On the table, the porcelain mug Claire had used was still there. A faint nude-colored lipstick stain marked the rim. On the wooden table, the circular indentation from the bottom of the cup was still damp. Ethan picked up the mug, intending to wash it, but his hand stopped mid-air. The porcelain was cold, but for a moment he could almost feel a lingering warmth. The sense of emptiness was most palpable in the spot where his white shirt used to hang, now gone along with the woman. Ethan sighed, placed the mug in the sink, and turned on the tiny television perched on top of the refrigerator to break the silence. He poured coffee grounds into the filter, listening to the morning news. And in shocking news this morning, Claire Bennett, CEO of Bennett Motors, has made a public appearance following rumors of her disappearance during last night's storm. Ethan's movements froze. He whipped his head around, staring at the grainy screen. On the TV, Claire's image was sharp. She stood in front of a private hospital, surrounded by a forest of microphones and flashing cameras, a stark contrast to the woman with wet hair in an oversized shirt in his kitchen just hours ago. The Claire on the screen wore a perfectly tailored suit. Her hair was impeccably styled, and her face was cold and authoritative. A reporter shouted, Ms. Bennett, there were rumors you were in a serious accident. Do you have anything to say to the person who saved you? Claire looked directly into the camera. Through the screen, her gaze seemed to pierce through space, reaching Ethan standing in his rundown kitchen. I am grateful, she answered, her voice firm and unwavering. And I will find him. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly. He reached out and turned off the TV. The screen went dark, returning the room to its original silence, but her words still echoed in his ears. Someone like her probably wouldn't even remember the name of a mechanic, he reassured himself, trying to shake off the turmoil in his chest. He looked out the window. The sky was still blue, but in his mind the image of the weak girl leaning on his shoulder last night and the powerful CEO on TV overlapped two separate entities, yet somehow the same person. Later that afternoon, at the small repair shop where Ethan worked, the smell of motor oil and the clang of metal filled the air. Mia sat on an empty oil drum in the corner of the shop, busy with a box of crayons while she waited for her dad to finish work. Daddy, look what I drew. Ethan wiped his hands on a greasy rag and walked over. On the white paper, a crudely drawn picture showed a large man carrying a woman amidst streaks of blue and black, representing the storm. Do I look like a hero? Ethan chuckled, his voice gentle. Yes, superheroes don't need capes. They just need to be strong, Mia said enthusiastically. Then her voice dropped. But where is she? In fairy tales, the person who gets saved always comes back to say thank you. Ethan froze. He looked at the drawing, then out at the sun-drenched yard in front of the shop. She has her own life, sweetie, and a thank you. Sometimes it doesn't need to be said. But I think she'll come back, Mia insisted firmly. Why do you think that? Because she borrowed your shirt. You have to return things you borrow. Before Ethan could answer, an unusual sound came from the gate. It wasn't the sputtering of old trucks or the whining of delivery scooters. It was the smooth, low hum of an expensive engine. Ethan looked up. A sleek black sedan, polished to a mirror, shine slowly rolled into the gravel and oil-stained yard of the shop. The luxury of the car was completely out of place amidst the surrounding junk. The car door opened. A pair of sharp, high-heeled shoes touched the dirty ground. Claire stepped out. She took off her sunglasses, revealing determined but calm eyes. In her hands was not a designer handbag, but Ethan's white shirt, washed, ironed, and neatly folded. She stood there in the late afternoon sun, looking directly at him. Ethan stood up, feeling as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Last night's storm was over, but it seemed a new one had just arrived at his doorstep. The afternoon sun faded on the puddles in the shop yard. Ethan dropped the greasy rag and walked towards the luxury car that had just pulled up. Claire stood there, her light-colored suit, a stark contrast to the messy backdrop of old tires and rusty barrels. I came to return this, she said, her voice calm, as she held out the neatly folded white shirt. Ethan took the shirt. It smelled of expensive fabric softener, completely devoid of the familiar scent of his damp wooden closet. Thanks. You didn't have to go to all this trouble. Claire didn't reply immediately. She looked around the shop, then went back to her car and took out a large yellow manila envelope, placing it on Ethan's dusty metal workbench. I'm not good at saying thank you with words, she said. These are the ownership papers for the house on Garden Street. Claire said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. I had my people buy the tenement this morning. Starting this month, you won't have to worry about rent or heating bills anymore. It's yours. The air in the shop seemed to freeze. Ethan looked at the file, then up at her. His jaw tightened. He took a step back, his voice dropping. Did you just turn a rescue into a business transaction? Take your papers and go. Claire was taken aback by his harsh reaction. She started to argue, but when she looked into Ethan's eyes, she stopped. Ethan also paused. He saw something different in her eyes. It was no longer the cold, powerful look he was used to. Her eyes were empty, with a fleeting glimpse of a deeply hidden vulnerability and pain. Claire slowly took back the file. She looked down, her voice suddenly choked with emotion, so soft it was almost lost in the evening breeze. Everyone needs to be saved sometimes. Even me. She looked up, avoiding his gaze. I grew up in poverty, Ethan, from one orphanage to another group home. I worked my way up so I would never have to want for anything again. And along the way, I forgot what it felt like to be helpless. She gave a sad, twisted smile. Until the accident. In that flooded car, my money was useless. You reminded me that money can't buy character. Ethan stood there stunned. The anger inside him dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. It turned out that behind the steel armor of a CEO was a person who had also been bruised by life. Just then, the shop's metal door swung open. Mia ran out her hand smudged with charcoal. Miss Yu really came back. The little girl's presence was like a cool breeze that blew away the heavy atmosphere. Mia ran to stand between them, looking up at Claire. "You looked prettier in Daddy's shirt yesterday than in this suit." Claire laughed quickly, wiping the corner of her eye. She knelt down, not caring about her expensive suit, and gently stroked Mia's messy hair. "Oh, really? Then maybe I'll borrow it again next time." Ethan watched them, letting out a soft, relieved sigh. He said, his voice deeper and warmer, "Don't turn me into someone who sells his good deeds. But if you want to thank me, a simple thank you is enough next time." Claire stood up, nodding slightly. She turned and walked back to her car, her posture seemingly lighter than when she arrived. The car drove away, leaving Ethan standing there with the white shirt in his hands and a completely different perspective on the woman. Later that night, Ethan was working late at the shop, checking a brake system. The space was quiet, with only the clinking of a wrench. His phone vibrated in his pocket. An unknown number. He wiped his hands on a rag and answered, "Hello." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Claire's voice came through, no longer condescending, but filled with a sincere urgency. "It's me, Claire Bennett. I need your help with something." Ethan paused. "What are you trying to buy this time?" Nothing. Claire's voice was serious. "Our newest prototype is having issues at the test track. The engineers are just staring at their computers, and I need someone who knows how to listen to an engine. I'm not calling as a CEO. I'm calling because I trust you." Ethan looked into the darkness of the shop, then at his calloused hands. For the first time, she was putting her faith in his skills, not her money. "Send me the address," he replied curtly. "I'm on my way." Ethan's old Ford F-150 turned into the main entrance of Bennett Motors headquarters, the rumbling of its exhaust completely out of place among the sleek, polished luxury cars parked neatly in a row. He cut the engine and looked through the windshield. The headquarters building was a skyscraper wrapped in reflective glass that mirrored the harsh sunlight, looking like an impenetrable fortress. Ethan took a deep breath and grabbed the heavy metal toolbox from the passenger seat. He looked down at his worn steel-toed boots and his jeans stained with a few streaks of motor oil. This wasn't his world, but he had made a promise. Stepping into the cool, cavernous lobby, Ethan felt as if all sound was swallowed by the thick carpet and high ceilings. Employees in suits with ID badges hurried past their eyes, glued to their phones or tablets. A security guard stepped in front of him, his eyes scanning Ethan from head to toe with suspicion. "Excuse me, sir, the delivery and maintenance entrance is on the south side. Please move your vehicle from the main entrance." Ethan tightened his grip on the toolbox, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm not making a delivery. Claire Bennett called me." The nearby receptionist looked up, raising an eyebrow as if she had just heard a bad joke. "Do you have an appointment? The CEO's schedule is full today." "She called me," Ethan repeated, patient but firm. Whispers started to ripple through the lobby. A few people stopped to point. Ethan stood alone in the middle of the lobby, a feeling of being out of place rising in his throat. Just as he was about to turn and leave the VIP elevator, in the center of the lobby opened. Claire strode out. She was wearing a gray business dress, her face clearly showing signs of stress. She walked straight towards Ethan, the sound of her high heels clicking on the marble floor with an authority that cut through all the curious stares. "You're here?" Claire said, her voice filled with relief. She turned to the guard and the receptionist, her tone sharp. "He's my guest. From now on, remember his face." The lobby fell silent. Ethan nodded to her, saying nothing, and quietly followed her into the elevator. When the elevator doors closed, shutting them off from the prying eyes outside, Ethan let out a breath. "Next time, give me an access card or I'll just climb the fence." Claire let out a small, tired smile. "Sorry, everything's a mess. Thanks for coming." The elevator took them down to basement level B2, the R&D department. Unlike the glitz and glamour upstairs, this place smelled of metal and the hum of machinery. In the middle of the large testing room, a group of young engineers surrounded a V8 prototype engine on a test stand. They were arguing heatedly, pointing at red charts on a computer screen. The camshaft sensor is reporting a phase error, but we've replaced the module and it's still not fixed, the lead engineer said, running his hands through his hair. We're going to have to postpone the prototype launch. Claire stepped forward, clapping her hands twice to get their attention. Everyone quiet down. I've brought a specialist to take a look. The entire group of engineers turned looking at Ethan with unconcealed doubt. A specialist? The lead engineer frowned, looking at Ethan's old toolbox. Ms. Bennett, this is a $500,000 prototype engine. We can't let a garage mechanic tinker with it. Ethan didn't wait for Claire to speak. He set his toolbox on the floor with a loud clang of metal. He didn't look at the computer screens, nor did he greet anyone. He walked straight to the engine, which was idling but vibrating abnormally. Turn off all the computers, Ethan said, his voice deep and resonant. What? The lead engineer asked, surprised. I said turn them off. The noise from the computer fans is keeping me from hearing the engine's rhythm. Claire nodded. The screens went dark. The room fell silent with only the sound of the engine's labored growl. Ethan closed his eyes. He tilted his head, pressing his ear close to the engine block. He heard the movement of the pistons, the turning of the crankshaft, and among them, a very small sound, a faint, irregular click that the electronic sensors had ignored, mistaking it for an acceptable level of vibration. He opened his eyes and took a small wrench from his toolbox. He reached into the narrow gap between the drive belt and the engine block and slightly tightened a bolt on the tensioner pulley, just a quarter turn. The clicking sound disappeared. The engine shuddered once, then settled into a smooth, even rhythm, purring like a cat. The charts on the screen, when turned back on, immediately turned a steady green. The lab was completely silent. The looks of disdain had now turned to sheer amazement. Ethan wiped his hands on his pants and picked up his toolbox. It wasn't a software issue. The tensioner pulley was loose, causing a resonance at low RPMs. The computer can't feel physical vibrations, but the human ear can. He turned to Claire and nodded slightly. It's done. Claire looked at him, her eyes shining with pride and admiration. She led him out of the lab, leaving behind the ashamed engineers. They took the elevator up to the 30th floor, her private office. The glass doors opened to a panoramic view of the city, sparkling in the afternoon sun. Ethan stood by the window, looking down at the tiny streets that looked like veins. Your world looks so orderly from up here. Claire stood next to him, her arms crossed. I'm used to controlling everything from this height. I thought that, with the right data and enough money, I could make anything work. But today I have to admit I was wrong. She turned to him. You were right. There are some things that machines can't replace. Ethan turned back, looking directly into her eyes. Trust isn't enough, Claire. You need to respect it too. Those guys down there, they're smart, but they trust the screens too much and have forgotten how to listen. Claire was silent for a moment, then walked over to her desk. She didn't reach for cash or a checkbook. She picked up a brand new employee ID card. I want to hire you, Claire said, her voice serious. Not out of pity, not to repay a debt. I want you to be an independent technical consultant for the test lab. You'll help my team learn to listen like you just did. Ethan looked at the card in her hand. This time he didn't feel insulted. He felt the weight of his profession being given its due respect. I'm not wearing a suit, he said, a slight smile playing on his lips. Claire smiled, the brightest smile he had ever seen from her. You can wear whatever you want, as long as you stay. Ethan took the card. As he stepped into the elevator to leave, Claire watched him until the doors closed. She whispered to herself in the vast office at the top of the world, for the first time, I feel like you actually belong here. Ethan walked out of the Bennett Motors building. The sun was setting, painting the sky red. He tossed his toolbox into his truck, feeling a sense of relief. An invisible bond stronger than any bolt he had ever tightened had begun to form between him and the woman on the top floor. A week after the incident at the test lab, Ethan returned to Bennett Motors. This time, he wasn't stopped at the main entrance, but the feeling of being out of place hadn't completely vanished as he walked through the cold glass walls. In the CEO's office, a young secretary placed a thick file on the glass table in front of him. Mr. Holt, this is the draft of the partnership agreement. Ms. Bennett would like you to review the confidentiality and compensation clauses before signing. Ethan looked at the inch-thick stack of paper filled with legal jargon that he would probably need a dictionary to understand. He didn't open it. Instead, he gently pushed the file aside with his calloused hand. The office door opened. Claire walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. She paused when she saw his action. "Is there a problem with one of the clauses?" she asked. "I don't need papers, Claire," Ethan replied, his voice calm. "I'm a mechanic, not a lawyer. I only work when I feel it's the right thing to do and with people I trust. If you were going to cheat me, this piece of paper wouldn't stop you." Claire put the coffee down and looked at him for a long moment, then let out a soft laugh. She turned to her bewildered secretary. "Put it away, Sarah. We'll do it his way." "But ma'am, the procedure—" "I make the procedures." Claire interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "And today, I'm changing them." The morning passed in the engineering workshop. Ethan didn't stand around pointing fingers like the previous consultants. He got under the cars, his hands covered in grease, teaching the young engineers how to feel the play and the wheel axle by hand, instead of using a laser measuring tool. The atmosphere in the workshop changed noticeably. The tension and fear of making mistakes disappeared, replaced by focus and respect. Around noon, a small incident occurred on the automated assembly line. A robotic arm suddenly stopped, its error light blinking. The engineers panicked and ran to get their laptops to run diagnostics. Claire, who was inspecting the line with Ethan, walked over. She looked at him. "What do you think?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the robot and took off his protective gloves. He placed his bare palm on the hot metal casing. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling the vibration. "It's tired," he said simply. "Tired?" a young engineer asked, surprised. "How can a machine be tired? The bearings in the pivot joint are dry, causing friction and heat." Ethan explained, reaching for a can of specialized lubricant. He sprayed it precisely into a small hidden crevice. It got too hot and shut itself down to protect the circuits. A few seconds later, the red light turned green. The robotic arm resumed its rhythmic movement. The entire team of engineers looked at him as if he were a magician. Claire stood beside him, her arms crossed, her eyes filled with pride. She said softly, just loud enough for the 2 of them to hear, "You make these inanimate machines seem more human." "They're just like people," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "If you don't take care of them properly, they'll eventually break down." At lunchtime, Ethan was about to go to his truck to eat his cold-cut sandwich when Claire stopped him. "Have lunch with me. The company cafeteria has a decent New England clam chowder today." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure the CEO having lunch with a mechanic will be the talk of the town?" "I'm hungry, and I don't care," she replied firmly. The 5th-floor cafeteria was packed. When Claire and Ethan walked in, the clatter of cutlery seemed to quiet down. All eyes turned to the corner table, where the most powerful woman in the building was sitting across from a man in a faded t-shirt. There was no wine or fancy food on their table, just 2 plastic trays, 2 turkey sandwiches, and 2 iced black coffees. Ethan took a bite of his sandwich and looked around. "You don't regret leaving your private dining room on the 30th floor. It's pretty noisy here." Claire stirred her coffee and looked at him. "Today I wanted to see the world from the perspective of the people who actually do the work. It's quiet on the 30th floor, but sometimes that quiet is very lonely." Ethan stopped chewing. He looked at her and realized that behind her perfect facade was a deep loneliness that she rarely showed. "Loneliness is a choice," he said softly. "At least here you can hear people laughing and talking." Claire looked around, and her expression softened. "Maybe you're right. Thank you, Ethan, and not just for the work." "For what?" "For showing me that I can trust someone without a contract." Ethan didn't say anything, just raised his plastic coffee cup and lightly tapped it against hers. A dull thud echoed, but to them, it resonated more than any crystal glass. Late in the afternoon, Ethan packed up his tools to go home. Claire walked him to the parking lot, an unprecedented act. As Ethan opened the door of his old pickup truck, he felt prying eyes from the gate. A few employees leaving work were whispering and pointing. "Who is that guy that Ms. Bennett is walking to his car? I heard he's the mechanic she met during the storm." Ethan turned to look at Claire. She seemed to notice the unusual attention too, but she didn't back down. She stood tall and smiled at him. "See you tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Ethan nodded. As he started the engine, he saw a flash of a camera from a car parked behind a row of trees in his rearview mirror. Ethan frowned. He had a feeling that the brief piece of their unwritten agreement was about to be shattered by a power more formidable than money public opinion. Monday morning started not with an alarm clock, but with a barrage of text messages that made Ethan's old phone vibrate uncontrollably on the wooden table. He rubbed his eyes and picked it up. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications from local news outlets. A paparazzi photo of him and Claire leaving the Bennett Motors building yesterday was all over social media. The headline screamed, "Powerful CEO and the mysterious mechanic, an off-the-books relationship." Ethan sighed and tossed the phone onto the couch. He knew their worlds were different, but he hadn't expected the collision to be this loud. When Ethan arrived at the shop, a crowd of reporters was already swarming the gate. The black lenses of their cameras were pointed straight at him as soon as he got out of his truck. "Mr. Holt, how much is Ms. Bennett paying you for this relationship? Are you using the accident to blackmail Bennett Motors?" Ethan pressed his lips together, silently pushing away the microphones being shoved in his face, trying to unlock the iron gate. He didn't want to say anything. Anything he said now would be twisted. Suddenly, the wooden door of the house flew open. Mia ran out, still clutching her worn-out teddy bear. Seeing her father surrounded, she yelled in her clear, childish voice, "Leave him alone. My daddy doesn't need anyone's money. He only saved her because she was hurt." The crowd of reporters froze for a second at the sight of the child, but then the flashes started again. Ethan, horrified, lunged forward to shield his daughter, but the screech of tires cut through the chaos. The familiar black sedan screeched to a halt in front of the gate. The door flew open. Claire got out, not with her usual composure, but with the fury of a protector. She strode through the crowd, pulled Mia behind her, and stood between the child and the cameras. "That's enough," Claire's voice was sharp and commanding. "No one is to film this child. If a single photo of her gets out, my lawyers will be in touch with every single one of your publications." The crowd backed away. For the first time, they saw the cold CEO standing on the same side as the grimy mechanic, forming a solid wall of protection for the little girl. The next day, Claire held a formal press conference in the grand lobby of the corporation. Ethan didn't stand on the podium. He chose to stand quietly in a secluded corner at the back of the room where the stage lights didn't reach. On the stage, Claire stood alone before hundreds of microphones. She didn't read from a prepared statement. She looked directly into the cameras. "I am Claire Bennett, and I am standing here alive thanks to Ethan Holt." She gave a signal. The large screen behind her played a video clip from a police car's dash cam from the night of the storm. The footage of Ethan using a tire iron to break the car window and rushing into the floodwaters to pull her out was clear and brutal. There was no romance, only life and death. The entire room was silent. "If I have any regrets," Claire continued, her voice trembling slightly but firm, "it's that I allowed my rescuer to be judged by the numbers in his bank account instead of by his character." A reporter raised a hand. "So, what is the relationship between the two of you?" Now Claire looked towards the corner of the room where Ethan was standing. Though no one could see him, she knew he was there. "It's trust," she replied. "It's as simple as that. In business and in life, that's the most valuable thing there is." After the press conference, the crowd dispersed. Claire stepped down and walked towards the empty hallway where Ethan was waiting. She looked tired, but her shoulders were relaxed. "You didn't have to make such a big deal out of it," Ethan said, handing her a bottle of water. "I don't care what they say." "I care," Claire said, taking the water and looking at him. "I've spent my whole life building my reputation, but today I realized that reputation is nothing without truth. I owed you a public show of respect." Ethan looked at her, then nodded slowly. "I trust you." Claire smiled, the most relieved and genuine smile he had ever seen from her. "But next time, don't make me stand up there alone in front of all those people." The flashes hurt my eyes. That evening at the small workshop, Ethan and Mia sat on the old sofa watching the evening news. On the screen, Claire was delivering the final line of her press conference. "Sometimes the person who fixes machines can also fix our faith in humanity." Mia looked up, her eyes shining. "Daddy, she's talking about you?" Ethan ruffled his daughter's hair and turned off the TV. The room returned to its usual quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. "She was talking to both of us, sweetie." Outside, the night wind blew through the crack in the window, but inside the warm yellow light cast a glow of warmth and peace. A new connection had been forged, not on paper, but on a foundation of protection and understanding between two different worlds. A pale yellow spring sunbeam slanted across the brand new sign hanging in front of the workshop. Coal Mobility Solutions, Innovations for a Better Life. Ethan stood wiping his hands on a cloth, nodding in satisfaction as he watched a young apprentice carefully installing a hand-controlled frame for a disabled person. The smell of grease still lingered, but the atmosphere in the workshop was now light and full of hope. On the exposed brick wall, a black and white photograph was elegantly framed, a man carrying a woman out of a flooded car in a storm. Below it was a handwritten signature, "Thank you, CB." The young apprentice looked up, pointing at the photo. "Boss, is this picture real? It looks like something out of a movie." Ethan chuckled and clapped the young man on the shoulder. "It's real, and it's the reason this place exists. Now, make sure you tighten the bolts on that wheel axle. Safety first." The familiar sound of a car engine came from the yard, but this time, Ethan no longer felt tense or on guard. Claire stepped out of her car. Gone were the stiff business suits. Today she wore a simple pair of blue jeans and a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her brown hair was tied back loosely, and she wore light makeup, making her look younger and more down to earth. Ethan walked out to greet her, half joking. "Are you here for another surprise inspection?" Claire took off her sunglasses and smiled brightly. "No, I'm here to collect on a promise. You said you'd treat me to coffee this week." They walked through the workshop. The mechanics nodded to Claire, but there was no longer any fear or deference in their greetings. She stopped by an electric wheelchair being assembled, her long, slender fingers gently touching the cold steel frame. "I used to think that value was found in financial reports," Claire said, her voice low and thoughtful. "But looking at these things, I see that true value lies in greasy hands like yours." Ethan looked at her, his eyes peaceful. "Every pair of hands has value, as long as they're doing honest work. You gave me the chance to use these hands for the right purpose." Just then, Mia ran out of the small office holding a large, freshly painted watercolor. She had grown a little taller, and her sneakers were no longer worn out. "Daddy, Miss Claire, look what I drew." Ethan and Claire both bent down. The painting depicted the scene in front of the workshop, with three figures standing together: a large man, a little girl holding flowers, and a smiling brown-haired woman. "It's beautiful," Ethan said, ruffling his daughter's hair. "But why didn't you color Miss Claire's shirt?" Mia tilted her head, studying the painting. "I didn't forget. I just didn't know which color to choose. She looks good in your white shirt, she looks cool in a black suit, and she looks pretty in the blue shirt she's wearing today." Claire laughed, crouching down to Mia's level. She looked at the painting where she was included in a family portrait, something she had never had during her lonely childhood in group homes. "You know," Claire said, her voice trembling with emotion, "this is the most beautiful painting I've ever seen. Thank you for letting me be in it." The afternoon passed quickly. As the sun began to set, Claire got ready to leave. Ethan walked her to her car, the atmosphere between them as comfortable as that of old friends. Next time, Ethan said, leaning against the car door, "If you want to thank me, don't buy me a house or invest in my machines. Just stop by for coffee." Claire opened the car door and turned back to him, her eyes sparkling. "Deal. I'll bring pastries next time. The passion fruit tarts from the corner bakery are amazing. It's a date. My bitter coffee goes well with sweet pastries." Claire drove away, leaving a thin trail of dust in the sunset. Ethan went back into the workshop to clean up. As he lifted his jacket from a chair, a small cream-colored envelope fell out. Claire must have slipped it in when he wasn't looking. Inside, there was no money, no contract, just a yellow sticky note with her slanted handwriting. "A question for tomorrow. If I come back and not just for coffee, would you mind if I stayed a little longer?" Ethan read the note, then folded it and carefully placed it in the left breast pocket of his shirt. He looked out the window at the sky turning a deep purple and smiled to himself. Tomorrow, a normal tomorrow, had suddenly become something to look forward to. Summer here usually started with a sweltering heat from early morning, but today a strangely cool breeze was blowing across Ethan's porch. When he opened the door to get the newspaper and check the mail, he didn't find the usual white envelopes with utility bills. Instead, a small textured recycled paper card sat on the wooden chair on the porch. Ethan picked it up. There was no postage stamp, just the familiar slanted and decisive handwriting. Instead of bills, I'm sending an invitation. Tonight, at the workshop, no suits, no speeches, just real people. C. B. Ethan turned the card over in his hands, a half smile playing on his lips. He went back inside, where Mia was eating her cereal. Mia, do you want to go to a party tonight? Her eyes lit up over her bowl of milk. A party. Will there be cake? I think so. Miss Claire is inviting us. Yay, Mia cheered. I'm going to wear my yellow dress. As night fell, Ethan's old repair shop was transformed. There were no loud sound systems or expensive flower arrangements. Instead, warm yellow string lights were haphazardly strung across the beams and car lifts. On the cleaned oil drums were small jars of wildflowers that someone had likely just picked from the edge of the woods. The guest list was small. There were a few old neighborhood mechanics, a few young apprentices, and a core group of engineers from Bennett Motors, all of whom had shed their business suits for comfortable polo shirts. The class divide seemed to disappear under the dim yellow lights and the smell of barbecue. Ethan stood leaning against his workbench, a can of soda in his hand, feeling both strange and warm in his own territory. The chatter died down as Claire stepped onto a wooden platform, a repurposed shipping pallet. Today she wore a simple white cotton dress, her hair down and natural. She held a microphone, not needing to look at any notes, her eyes scanning the faces below and landing on Ethan. A year ago, her voice was deep and clear in the quiet space I was pulled from a wrecked car in a storm. At that moment, I thought I had lost everything. She took a deep breath. But what I took away from that night wasn't just my life. I took away a lesson: when the storm hits, what saves you isn't your bank account, but the hand of a stranger who dares to stop. The workshop was completely silent. Mia sat in the front row clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide as she looked at Miss Claire. Claire stepped down from the platform and walked straight towards Ethan. The crowd parted, creating a small path. She stood before him no longer with the distance of a CEO and a mechanic, but as a woman standing before the man she trusted. She took a small black velvet box from her pocket. Ethan frowned, his heart beating a little faster. Claire opened the box. Inside was not a sparkling diamond ring. It was a small polished stainless steel circle looking more like a washer from a machine than a piece of jewelry. On its cool metal surface was a tiny inscription: "For what money can't buy." Claire looked deep into his eyes, her voice trembling slightly but firm. I don't know if this counts as a traditional proposal. I also don't know if you want to tie your life to someone as complicated as me. She paused for a beat, then continued. But I want us to hold on to this together. This ring reminds me of that night and of you. I want you to keep it so that whenever I lose myself in that glamorous world, you'll be the one to bring me back down to earth. Ethan looked at the steel ring in the box, then at her expectant face. He didn't say any flowery words. He slowly reached out with his calloused hand and took the ring. It was cold, solid, and real, just like him. He nodded, his voice deep and warm. Okay, I'll keep it. And I'll keep you too if you need me to. The solemn atmosphere was suddenly broken by a high-pitched voice. Daddy, Miss Claire. If this is a wedding, do I get to cut the cake? I'm hungry. Ethan and Claire were startled, then burst into laughter. The people around them cheered and applauded. The tension melted away, replaced by a simple, everyday joy. Claire bent down and pulled Mia into a hug, kissing her on the forehead. Of course. You're the most important witness I've ever had. Without you, your daddy probably wouldn't have even opened the door for me. Ethan placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder and smiled at Claire. Don't spoil her. She'll start demanding cake for dinner. As the party wound down and the guests had mostly gone home, the yellow string lights still glowed, swaying gently in the night breeze. Mia had fallen asleep on the sofa in the office. Claire stood leaning against the large workshop door, looking out at the quiet street. Ethan walked over holding 2 steaming paper cups. Still like cheap coffee, he asked, handing one to her. Claire took it, warming her hands around the cup. No, but I like the way you make it. It tastes like reassurance. They stood together in silence. The streetlight cast a glow reflecting off the small steel ring that Ethan had put on his pinky finger, the only one it fit. Tomorrow you'll go back to being a CEO, Ethan said, looking into the distance. There will be other storms. I know, Claire said, taking a sip of coffee and looking up at him, her eyes soft and steady. But I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know that when the storm comes, I have a place to take shelter. Ethan turned to her, his voice slow and deliberate like a promise. If you still believe in the things that money can't buy tomorrow, then I'll still be here. This door is never locked to you. Claire smiled a smile, not for the cameras or the press, but only for the man standing next to her. I don't trust easily, Ethan Holt. But this time, I'm betting everything on you. From the office, Mia's sleepy voice mumbled, "Cake? Is there any cake left?" Ethan and Claire looked at each other and chuckled, their laughter mingling with the sound of the rustling night wind. They didn't need a fairy tale ending. They just needed this moment amidst the smell of motor oil, the yellow lights, and the warmth of a cup of coffee to know that their lives had truly been healed. Their story ends here, but perhaps their peaceful days together have only just begun. After the storm, they realize something simple: kindness doesn't just save a life. Sometimes it heals two lonely souls. If you also believe that the most beautiful love stories blossom from selfless kindness,